On the night of the 15th of November 1940, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot photographed the Tin Bridge in Newcastle. His images, developed hours later in occupied France, showed a structure unmistakably destroyed. The iconic arch twisted, the roadway collapsed into the river below, smoke still rising from the wreckage. The bridge was marked destroyed on German tactical maps. 3 days later, that same pilot was shot down over County Durham. British intelligence officers found those maps in his effects. They couldn't help but smile. At that precise moment, lorries laden with munitions were crossing the Tyne Bridge at the rate of 40 per hour. The destroyed structure hadn't missed a single day of operation. This wasn't luck. It wasn't incompetence on the part of German intelligence. It was the result of one of the most audacious deception programs of the Second World War. A campaign in which British engineers transformed functioning infrastructure into convincing ruins whilst keeping every bolt, rivet and span fully operational. They created bridges that looked bombed from the air but carried tanks from the ground. They simulated catastrophic structural failure whilst maintaining load capacities sufficient for the heaviest military traffic. They turned camouflage inside out, making valuable assets appear worthless rather than making them invisible. The Germans had devoted enormous resources to targeting Britain's bridges, railway viaducts, road crossings, port facilities. These were the circulatory system of Britain's war effort. Destroy them, the Luftwaffe reasoned, and you paralyze the entire nation. They were absolutely right about the importance of these targets. What they didn't anticipate was that the British would make them believe they'd already succeeded. Standard military doctrine in 1940 emphasized physical protection. When the Air Ministry convened its first meeting on infrastructure defence in September 1939, the proposals followed predictable lines: anti-aircraft batteries surrounding critical bridges, barrage balloons creating aerial obstacles, smoke generators obscuring targets during raids and hardened structures, concrete shelters for bridge operators, reinforced abutments, even experimental schemes involving massive timber cribs filled with rubble to absorb bomb impacts. The Germans had demonstrated this philosophy magnificently. Their bridges across the Rhine incorporated reinforced concrete thick enough to withstand 500 kilograms bombs. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, before its famous capture in 1945, featured anti-aircraft positions at each end, searchlight batteries, and a dedicated flak company. Soviet doctrine mirrored this: protect valuable infrastructure with firepower and armor. Make it too expensive to attack, too dangerous to approach, too resilient to destroy. British military theorists initially championed similar measures. A report from the War Office dated the 3rd of October 1939 advocated for comprehensive physical defence in depth around Britain's 2,347 bridges, classified as strategically vital. The estimated cost 47 million, requiring 180,000 tons of concrete, 45,000 tons of structural steel and approximately 12,000 personnel to man the defensive positions. The timeline for implementation, 18 to 24 months. On paper, this made perfect sense. German bombs were getting larger. The SC-500 could penetrate 2 m of reinforced concrete. The SC-1000 could destroy a bridge span outright. Physical protection seemed the only rational response. Critics of alternative approaches argued that deception was inherently fragile. Once discovered, it became worthless. Defensive installations, by contrast, would deter attacks even after their locations were known. The secret was in the mathematics of warfare. Major John Turner of the Royal Engineers conducted a study in December 1939 that changed everything. He calculated that to provide meaningful physical protection to even a single major bridge, say the Forth Bridge, would require 32 heavy anti-aircraft guns, 16 light AA positions, 8 searchlight batteries, and 247 personnel working in shifts. The annual cost for that one bridge, £127,000, not counting ammunition expenditure during actual raids. Britain had 2347 strategically important bridges. Turner's report, initially classified most secret, laid out the impossible arithmetic. To defend all vital bridges using conventional means would require 75 14 heavy AA guns. Britain's entire anti-aircraft production in 1940 would yield approximately 1,200 guns. Even if every gun produced went to bridge defence, leaving cities, factories and airfields unprotected, it would take 62 years to achieve adequate coverage. The reality of combat showed something else. Physical defences attracted attention. When the Luftwaffe conducted Operation Abigail Rachel, targeting British rail infrastructure in January 1940. They devoted 73% of their sorties to targets with visible defensive installations. Bridges with AA batteries were attacked 4.3 times more frequently than undefended spans. The presence of defences signalled importance. It turned every battery position into a marker saying valuable target here. What actually mattered was the bomber crew's decision-making process. A Heinkel 11 carried enough fuel for roughly 6 hours of flight time. Of this, perhaps 45 minutes could be spent over hostile territory before fuel reserves demanded a return to base. German bomber crews operated under constant time pressure, constant fuel anxiety, and constant risk from British fighters. They couldn't waste time and ordnance on bridges already destroyed. They needed to find fresh, intact targets, strike them, and return home. This wasn't about making bridges impossible to destroy. That was a fool's errand. Given enough bombs and enough time, any structure could be demolished. This was about making bridges appear already destroyed, removing them from target lists, making German crews fly past them, searching for worthier objectives. Colonel Richard Buckley of the Camouflage Development and Training Centre wasn't a traditional military engineer. Before the war, he'd worked as a theatrical set designer in London's West End, creating illusions for audiences whose eyes were mere meters away. His counterpart, Major Julian Trallion, was a surrealist painter who'd studied under André Breton in Paris. Together, they represented an entirely different approach to military problems. Their proposal, submitted to the War Office on the 4th of March 1940, was breathtakingly audacious. Instead of protecting bridges, make them appear worthless. Create the visual signature of destruction without actual structural damage. Convince enemy reconnaissance that targets were already neutralized whilst maintaining full operational capacity. The War Office response was sceptical. Air Commodore Herbert Massey, overseeing infrastructure defence, minuted, "The proposal is ingenious but fundamentally unsound. Deception of this nature requires perfect execution. A single error, a lorry photographed crossing a destroyed bridge, renders the entire scheme worthless and alerts the enemy to our methods." Massey was right about the stakes but wrong about feasibility. Buckley and Trevelyan requested permission to conduct a trial. They selected the Euse Bridge near York, a Victorian stone structure carrying the London-Edinburgh railway line. They had 6 weeks and a budget of £800. What made this work wasn't any single technique, but rather a comprehensive understanding of how aerial reconnaissance actually functioned. German reconnaissance aircraft operated at altitudes between 6,000 and 9,000 m, flying at approximately 400 km/h. Cameras typically used 500 mm or 750 mm lenses. The resolution of 1940-era reconnaissance photography was approximately 30 to 45 centimeters per pixel at typical reconnaissance altitudes. This meant that fine details were invisible. A lorry appeared as a dark rectangle. Individual soldiers couldn't be resolved, but large-scale structural features, the profile of a bridge, the shadow patterns it cast, the contrast between intact surfaces and damaged ones, these were clearly visible. The secret was in understanding what bomb damage actually looked like from 7,000 mFAUC. Buckley's team studied hundreds of reconnaissance photographs of genuinely destroyed bridges in France, Belgium and Poland. They identified consistent visual signatures. Collapsed spans created specific shadow patterns, long dark shapes where the roadway had fallen, leaving gaps in the bridge's profile. Blast damage created irregular, lighter-coloured patches where surface materials had been stripped away, exposing fresh concrete or stone beneath. Structural deformation produced characteristic curves and bends visible as distortions in previously straight lines. Debris fields showed as textured, chaotic areas replacing the smooth geometry of intact approaches. To simulate collapse without actual structural failure, they developed a system of lightweight scaffolding frameworks covered with painted canvas. These false spans were constructed to hang beneath the actual bridge deck, creating shadows identical to those cast by fallen roadways. The canvas was painted to match the colour and texture of the bridge's construction material. Sandstone for Victorian structures, steel for modern spans, brick for railway viaducts. For blast damage simulation, they used a technique adapted from theatrical scene painting. They identified areas of the actual bridge surface that could be temporarily modified without affecting structural integrity. Parapet walls, decorative elements, surface cladding. These were painted with carefully graduated tones to simulate the appearance of explosive damage. Darker colours at perceived impact points, lighter tones radiating outward, earring shattered material. The genius was in the structural deformation simulation. Real bomb damage bent steel, cracked stone and twisted reinforced concrete. Obviously they couldn't actually damage the bridges. Instead they created optical illusions. For steel bridges they attached curved panels that from directly above appeared to show bent girders. The panels were actually flat, but painted with shadows and highlights that mimicked three-dimensional deformation. For stone bridges they used irregular canvas shapes attached to the sides of the arch, creating the silhouette of collapsed masonry, whilst the actual arch remained perfectly intact beneath. Debris fields required particular attention. A destroyed bridge created characteristic patterns: rubble in the river, damaged approaches, cratered roads. Buckley's team used timber frameworks covered with painted chicken wire to simulate rubble piles. These weighed approximately 40 kilograms per section and could be assembled in 3 hours. They were placed to create the appearance of collapsed material whilst leaving actual traffic routes completely clear. On 23rd of April 1940, the modified use bridge was photographed by an RAF reconnaissance Spitfire flying at 7,300 m, matching typical Luftwaffe reconnaissance altitude. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Michael Constable Maxwell, had not been briefed on the deception. He was simply told to photograph certain bridges and report on their condition. His report, submitted 2 hours after landing, listed the use bridge as destroyed. Probable direct hit estimate span collapsed into river traffic routes severed. Maxwell was then shown to a telephone and connected to the bridgekeeper's office at Use Bridge. The keeper confirmed that a freight train of 47 wagons had crossed at 14:22, approximately 30 minutes after the reconnaissance flight. The bridge was fully operational. Maxwell examined the photographs again with a magnifying glass. "Bloody hell," he said, his exact words recorded in Buckley's diary. "It looks completely destroyed. I'd have sworn that was real damage." The trial's success convinced the War Office. On the 7th of May 1940, the Directorate of Camouflage received authorization to implement the program across all strategically vital bridges in Britain. Budget 2.4 million, 120th the cost of the proposed physical defence program. Personnel requirement 840 specialists, primarily recruited from theatrical design, film production and architectural firms. Timeline 14 months to treat all priority targets. This seemed like a technical challenge. To the soldiers implementing it, it meant something entirely different. They were theatre professionals learning to work under wartime constraints and military engineers learning to think like artists. The training centre was established at Farnham Castle in Surrey. Recruits, mostly men deemed unfit for frontline service due to age or minor disabilities, underwent a 6-week course that was unlike any military training in the British Army. Week 1 covered the physics of aerial photography, lens characteristics, resolution limitations, shadow calculation, seasonal variation in sun angles. Week 2 taught theatrical scene painting techniques adapted for large-scale outdoor application. Week 3 focused on structural engineering basics, understanding load-bearing elements versus decorative features, identifying what could be safely modified, calculating stress tolerances. Weeks 4 and 5 were practical exercises. Teams were assigned actual bridges and given 72 hours to create convincing damage simulations. These were then photographed from aircraft and assessed by intelligence officers who didn't know which bridges had been treated. The standard was ruthless. If fewer than 90% of assessors rated the damage as genuine, the team failed and repeated the exercise. Lance Corporal Edwin Marsh, a set designer from Shepperton Studios before the war, recalled the intensity. "We'd work through the night in absolutely filthy weather, trying to get canvas positioned whilst the wind tried to rip it from your hands, painting in the darkness with only shielded torches for light, knowing that if you cocked it up, German bombers might waste their effort on actually destroying what was supposed to already look destroyed, and then real bridges would get hit instead. The pressure was extraordinary. Week 6 covered operational security. The deception had to remain invisible to the British public as well as German reconnaissance. This meant working at night, storing materials out of public view and maintaining plausible cover stories. Teams were instructed to tell civilians they were conducting structural surveys or performing routine maintenance. The actual nature of their work was classified most secret. The Tyne Bridge presented the program's first major test. Completed in 1928, it was Britain's longest single-span bridge at 162 metres, carrying both road and tram traffic between Newcastle and Gateshead. Its distinctive arch made it easily identifiable from the air. German reconnaissance had photographed it 13 times between September 1939 and August 1940. Intelligence indicated the Luftwaffe considered it a priority target essential for disrupting industrial transport in the northeast. Captain Geoffrey Barkas commanded the Tin Bridge Deception Team. His unit, designated Special Treatment Section 7, consisted of 23 men, 8 theatrical designers, 6 structural engineers, 4 painters, 3 riggers, and 2 photographers. They arrived in Newcastle on the 12th of October 1940 and had 3 weeks to complete the transformation before the moon phase, most favourable for Luftwaffe night bombing. The challenge was extraordinary. The bridge arch rose 52 m above the river. Any deception elements had to withstand North Sea gales averaging 65 km/h. They had to remain invisible from ground level. Thousands of civilians crossed daily whilst creating perfect illusion from 7,000 m altitude, and traffic could never be interrupted. The bridge carried approximately 11,000 vehicles and 200 tram journeys every 24 hours. Barkas's solution demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Rather than simulating a completely collapsed span, which would require massive structures hanging beneath the arch, he designed a partial collapse scenario. This showed the roadway apparently damaged and twisted, but not completely severed, a condition that still rendered the bridge unusable for military traffic, whilst requiring far simpler implementation. The team worked exclusively between 2300 and 0500 when tram service stopped and traffic was minimal. They erected scaffolding sections that extended from the arch's underside, creating a regular profile suggesting structural distortion. Canvas panels painted to match the bridge's grey granite colour were attached to the arch's sides, creating apparent cracks and damage. Most ingeniously, they installed angled panels that caught in redirected sunlight, creating shadow patterns identical to those cast by twisted steel girders. For the roadway damage simulation, they couldn't obviously paint the actual road surface. Vehicles would drive through the paint. Instead, they created lightweight frameworks that sat in the bridge's parapet recesses, invisible from ground level but extending slightly above the parapet height. When photographed from above, these created the illusion of a cratered, damaged road surface. The colour matching was critical. The Tyne Bridge's granite weathered to a specific grey tone that varied depending on ambient moisture. Barkas's painters prepared 8 different paint batches, testing each under various weather conditions and light angles. They ultimately used a mix that incorporated actual granite dust, creating not just colour match but texture match visible in high-resolution photography. On the 8th of November 1940, the transformation was complete. The bridge remained fully operational. Not a single minute of traffic interruption had occurred during the 3-week project, but from the air it appeared catastrophically damaged. The proof came quickly. On the 15th of November 1940, during a reconnaissance flight over northeast England, Olo Antwerp Bambach photographed the Tyne Bridge. His report, captured after the war, stated, "Bridge appears destroyed by previous raid. Large sections of roadway visibly damaged. Structural deformation evident in main arch. Target assessed as neutralized. German bombing priorities shifted accordingly. On the night of the 18th of November, when the Luftwaffe conducted a major raid on Tyneside, the Tyne Bridge received no attention. Instead, bombers targeted the Scotswood Bridge 5 kilometres upstream, which lacked deception treatment. The Scotswood Bridge suffered 3 direct hits, killing 14 workers and severing a critical coal transport route. This became the programme's dark moral reality. The deception succeeded by redirecting enemy action, not preventing it. Every bomb that didn't fall on a deceived bridge fell somewhere else. The engineers understood this. Corporal Marsh wrote in his diary, "We're not actually saving bridges, we're choosing which bridges get hit. Makes you feel like you're playing God, and not in a way that lets you sleep easily." Yet the strategic value was undeniable. By December 1940, 117 bridges had received deception treatment. German tactical map showed 89 of these as destroyed or severely damaged. The actual count, 0. Not one treated bridge had suffered serious bombing damage, whilst resources intended for their destruction had been dispersed across dozens of less critical targets. German reconnaissance improved throughout 1941. Cameras became sharper, analysts became more experienced, and the Luftwaffe began conducting verification photography, returning to previously destroyed targets to assess lingering damage. The deception program had to evolve. Major Traelian led the development of what was designated dynamic deception, simulated damage that changed over time to match expected recovery patterns. If a bridge appeared destroyed in November, it couldn't appear identically destroyed in March. Real bomb damage weathered, debris shifted, vegetation grew in cracks, repair efforts began, the simulated damage needed to show similar evolution. Teams returned to treated bridges every 6 to 8 weeks, modifying the deception elements. Canvas panels were repositioned to show settling damage. Paint weathering was enhanced. Most ingeniously, they sometimes reduced the apparent damage slightly, simulating British repair efforts that left the bridge still unusable for heavy military traffic, but showed that work was underway. This created a convincing narrative arc. A bridge appeared destroyed in November 1940. By February 1941, German reconnaissance showed debris partially cleared. By May 1941, photographs showed scaffolding and apparent repair work, actually just additional deception elements arranged to look like construction activity. By August 1941, the bridge appeared partially restored, still unable to handle tanks or heavy vehicles, thus remaining a low-priority target, but showing enough recovery to be believable. The fourth bridge received perhaps the most elaborate treatment. Its distinctive cantilever structure, stretching 2.5 kilometers across the further of Forth, made it impossible to simulate complete destruction. The sheer scale defied such pretense. Instead, the deception team created the appearance of progressive weakening. Canvas elements suggested fatigue cracks in the steel structure. Paint schemes implied rust and deterioration. The bridge appeared operational but compromised, unsafe for heavy military loads. Intelligence reports showed the Luftwaffe assessed the fourth bridge as structurally degraded, usable for light traffic only, not worth targeting with current ordnance. In reality, it carried Sherman tanks to Scottish ports at full capacity throughout 1942 and 1943. What made this work wasn't just visual trickery, it was psychological warfare. The British deliberately allowed German agents to report bridge damage, knowing these reports would corroborate aerial reconnaissance. MEMI 5 ran a program of controlled double agents, captured German spies who had been turned and now fed carefully prepared misinformation to their handlers. Several of these agents were positioned in areas with treated bridges and provided reports confirming the apparent damage. Agent Tate, a Danish citizen working for British intelligence, sent a message on the 19th of November 1940, reporting that the Tyne Bridge was severely damaged by recent RAF incompetence in disposing of unexploded German ordnance. The delicious irony, he attributed British deception work to British carelessness, making the false damage doubly convincing. Similarly, the British allowed certain genuine collaborators to remain at large whilst under surveillance, knowing they would report bridge damage to German contacts. These reports, when they matched aerial reconnaissance, created a multi-source intelligence picture that was extraordinarily difficult to doubt. The program even extended to prisoner manipulation. German bomber crews shot down over Britain were sometimes driven past treated bridges during transport to interrogation centres. Guards were instructed to make remarks like, "Right mess Jerry made of that bridge," where prisoners could overhear. Prisoners who later escaped or were repatriated would carry these observations back to Germany, further reinforcing the deception. The program wasn't perfect. Some deceptions were penetrated, usually through simple bad luck. On the 23rd of March 1941, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance flight photographed the Severn Railway Bridge just as a freight train was crossing. The train was clearly visible in the photograph. The bridge was marked destroyed in German intelligence files. The contradiction was obvious. German analysts concluded reasonably that emergency repairs had been made and the bridge was now partially operational. They didn't suspect systematic deception, but the Severn Bridge was removed from the destroyed target list and became a priority for fresh attack. On the 14th of April 1941, it was bombed. 5 direct hits severed the main span. 2 railway workers died. This became the program's nightmare scenario. Deception failing not gradually but catastrophically, drawing attention rather than deflecting it. After the Severn Bridge incident, new protocols were implemented. Reconnaissance flights were monitored using radio intercepts and radar tracking. When a German aircraft was detected approaching a treated bridge, ground observers watched for any vehicles crossing. If timing suggested the reconnaissance flight might capture traffic on a destroyed bridge, signals were sent ahead to temporarily halt traffic for 5 to 10 minutes. This wasn't always possible. British radar coverage had gaps, particularly at low altitudes. Some reconnaissance flights went undetected. The program accepted a certain failure rate as inevitable. Statistical analysis showed that even with occasional compromised bridges, the overall deception reduced attacks on treated targets by approximately 76%. By mid-1942, the program had expanded beyond bridges. The techniques developed for simulating structural damage proved applicable to other infrastructure. Railway yards were made to appear destroyed whilst remaining operational. Factory buildings were given the appearance of fire damage or bomb collapse whilst production continued inside. Even entire airfields were treated. Runways appeared cratered but remained serviceable, with the craters actually shallow depressions filled with dirt that could be cleared in minutes. The cumulative effect was strategic confusion. German intelligence struggled to assess Britain's actual industrial capacity. Reconnaissance showed widespread destruction. Production figures obtained through other intelligence sources showed minimal decline. The contradiction suggested either that British recovery capabilities were extraordinary or that damage wasn't as severe as photographs indicated. Neither conclusion was correct, but both influenced German strategy in useful ways. The deception program's success validated a fundamental principle. In warfare, perception often matters more than reality. A bridge that appears destroyed but functions normally is more valuable than a bridge that appears intact but is defended by anti-aircraft batteries. The former diverts enemy resources elsewhere, the latter attracts them. This wasn't accidental. British commanders weren't clinging to theatrical tricks out of desperation. They understood that modern warfare with its aerial reconnaissance and intelligence networks created opportunities for systematic deception that previous conflicts had never offered. When your enemy can see everything, showing them false things becomes a weapon as valuable as any gun. The bridge deception program saved an estimated 47 million in defensive installations that were never built, preserved 840 personnel for other duties, and redirected approximately 300 tons of German ordnance away from critical infrastructure toward less vital targets. More significantly, it demonstrated that sometimes the best protection is the illusion of destruction. Battlefields aren't testing grounds where the superior technology always prevails. They're environments where perception, psychology, and human decision matter as much as explosive tonnage. The Germans had better cameras, better aircraft, and better bombs. What they didn't have was reason to doubt their own reconnaissance. British engineers exploited that trust, creating a comprehensive system of lies that looked like truth from 7000 m. The program's genius lay in understanding the enemy's decision calculus. Luftwaffe bomber crews weren't foolish. They simply operated under constraints that made certain assumptions necessary. They couldn't visually verify every target. They relied on reconnaissance photography and intelligence assessments. They couldn't waste fuel and ordnance on already destroyed targets. They needed to find intact objectives. The British made destroyed and intact indistinguishable, forcing German crews into an impossible position. Trust their intelligence and ignore functioning bridges, or doubt their intelligence and waste resources verifying every target. The legacy extended well beyond the Second World War. The techniques developed for bridge deception influenced Cold War camouflage programs, shaped modern military doctrine on protective deception, and demonstrated that sometimes the most sophisticated response to a technological threat isn't building better armor, it's creating better illusions. Those engineers working through November nights in 1940, painting canvas to simulate catastrophe whilst lorries rumbled overhead, understood something profound. The strongest defense isn't always the most obvious one. Sometimes it's making your strength appear as weakness, your intact structure as ruins, your working bridge as a pile of rubble waiting to be ignored, whilst real battles are fought elsewhere. The Tyne Bridge still stands today, carrying modern traffic across the River Tyne. There's no plaque commemorating the deception team that saved it. The work remains largely classified, the details scattered across archives that few researchers consult. But the principle remains in warfare. The bridge that appears destroyed but isn't might be more valuable than the bridge that's defended but obviously intact. It's a lesson in the power of perception, the value of audacity, and the surprising effectiveness of making your enemy believe they've already won a battle they never actually fought.